In 1999, at our International Chair Conference, those of you who were here remembered we had David White, and he used the art form of poetry to talk to us about authenticity. And in our chair conference in 2000, we had Joe Pine talked about performance. Today, we're very fortunate to have our first international keynote speaker, truly international keynote speaker, from the United Kingdom, Richard Olivier, who's going to talk about authentic performance. Richard is the director of Olivier Mythodrama Associates. That's an arts-based learning consultancy that uses experiential exercises, rehearsal techniques, and stories from Shakespeare to release leadership and creative potential, enhance presentation skills, and facilitate change management. Richard's been a leading theater director for over 10 years and directed Henry V for the opening of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London in 1997. And he's worked extensively in the fields of organizational and personal development. He's a visiting fellow at the Cranfield School of Management and the artistic director of the Mythodrama programs in partnership with Cranfield at the Shakespeare Globe Theatre. Richard also works internationally as an independent consultant and a conference speaker and a workshop leader. His latest book, actually, each one of you have a copy of, Inspirational Leadership, Henry V and the Muse of Fire, was published by the Industrial Society in May 2001. I have finished the book. It's a really inspirational book and has lots of good material for each one of you to use in your tech experience. Yeah, it just as an additional sidelight, actually, Richard Olivier and David White are put on every year in the Globe Theatre in London, a wonderful leadership seminar utilizing Shakespeare and some of those techniques, and I understand it's just marvelous. Please join me in welcoming Richard Olivier.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to our 90 minutes on inspirational leadership. I'll start with something that I heard 2 weeks ago at Davos, the World Economic Forum. I was invited to play with Shakespeare for a couple of workshops. And they'd just done a bit of research into the way that CEOs were perceived all over the world. And they found that the bosses who were the most trusted in the world were those in the armed forces, in the United Nations, and in NGOs. Those that were least trusted were those in government and the heads of big companies. The leaders of those institutions in government and big companies were trusted even less than the institutions. And the country in which leaders of big institutions was trusted least of all was the USA. So I think it's fair to say we've got a job for life. So this notion of inspiration and authentic performance, to me, is the key in how we can leverage the world being a better place in the future, to put it very simply. And the basis of it is that if we don't know what inspires us, we won't be able to inspire others. So the work kind of begins with each of us and then moves forward. As Richard mentioned, I was honored and privileged to direct Henry V at the Globe Theatre, whose stage you see behind you, in '97. And at that time, we were very concerned with the notion of authenticity as it applied to theatre. What is relevant about using 400-year-old plays in the modern world? And we put together a little workshop of public service leaders to explore what we thought were emerging themes of leadership in the play. We spoke to these people, worked with them in a workshop for 2 days, and at the end we asked them, what did you get from it? Was it worth it? What bits of Henry V's story are out of date? And they said actually nothing. Everything they got from the play was valuable to them as modern leaders and managers. The only thing they were puzzled by was Henry V's ability to send his traitors to the Tower of London, and they were rather jealous of that. So we're going to have a look at some of those mythic backbones in the story of Henry V. You'll notice that there is a kind of overarching theme of a leader gathering together a group of people, taking them on a mission in order to achieve a particular goal. The play starts with a prologue, "Oh, for a muse of fire," that you heard this morning. Now, this muse of fire is a call to the imagination, the ability to move beyond the known world, the brightest heaven of invention, to the as yet unknown future. And I believe that modern leaders require more access to imagination than they ever have before. And I use something that Albert Einstein said as a scientist at the end of his life. He said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Imagination is more important than knowledge because while knowledge points to all there is, imagination points to all there will be. So that access to imagine the future and manage the present, I think, is a crucial conundrum for inspiring leaders. As we move into Act 1 of the play, we see Henry, first of all, assessing the past and then visioning the future. So he has to, of course, figure out where he's been in order to figure out where he wants to go. In order to successfully sell that vision of the future, he has to figure out a way of embodying it in all his people. So he has to build consent. He has a mission in mind, which is to reclaim the lost territory of France. So I'm going to invite you to think of this for the next 89 minutes, not as an aggressive takeover bid, but as the right we all have to manage the territory that is within our soul's reach. So what's the appropriate place for us to step? What's the appropriate territory for us to lead within? In order to achieve that, he has to connect the mission to what I'm going to call a vision of the future. Why is this mission serving a brighter future? And he also has to connect that mission to the individuals whose support he most needs. And he has to do that by accessing what I call their individual sense of purpose. Henry Ford said a long time ago, no one at work is apathetic, except those in pursuit of someone else's objectives. So the task then being, how do we make our objectives their objectives? And how do we get them to take those objectives on, treat them as their own, in order to disseminate them to other people? And his last task in Act 1 is to sell the vision, to stand up, committed, passionate enough, and deliver the words that are going to take his people forward. And this is where some of the performance comes in. Because, of course, you've done all the work, you've done all the research, you've done all the consent building. You know there are people out there who don't agree with you. You know there are people who think you shouldn't be going to France, you should be going to Spain. Probably a few people who think you'd be lucky to make the Channel Islands this year. And you've got to figure out how to sell that. And that takes a little bit of performance. The authentic bit is that you've done your homework and you believe it's the right place to go. The performance is you have to deliver it in a way that everyone else believes you. There was something that famous comedian George Burns said just before he died. He said, the only thing you need to be a good actor is sincerity. And once you can fake that, you've got it made. I don't believe that. You can fake it for a little bit, but in leadership positions, if you start faking it more than once or twice and people see through you, it can take a lifetime to rebuild that lost trust. So knowing that you do actually stand for what you're asking people to do and figuring out how to align yourself to it becomes a crucial Act 1 task. As we move into Act 2, we see Henry allocating his resources. We're not going to talk about external resources this morning, but we will talk about internal resources. How do we get all of ourselves behind a particular project, and how do we identify the bits of ourselves that need to be brought up a notch or two to increase our skills or behavior in a certain direction? I'll be using a little model I've developed at the Cranfield School of Management based on archetypal psychology, looking at some of the characters, I call them, of leadership that we might like or dislike to play. And we'll have a look at that later on. As we mentioned before, there are, of course, the blockers. In the play, they come across as traitors and old friends. And we'll have a little look at how they might get in our way. As Henry manages to deal with them very effectively with his traitor management system, he is able to set foot into the new desired territory, to take the first steps into France. But almost as inevitably, he sets out with a very simple strategic plan. He comes against the first blocks to success. He gets stuck on the ground with no quick wins, 3 months outside the little town of Harfleur. He has to change behavior, tactics, and finally strategy to overcome those first blocks to success. But once he's done that, by motivating the troops and painting negative pictures for the opposition, he then manages to stage a strategic withdrawal to Calais, but finds himself chased and surrounded by 40,000 fresh French mounted troops on the field of Agincourt. And this is what sends him into what I cheerfully call the dark night of the soul. The long, dark night before the battle, when we have to ask ourselves some of the big, big questions. What am I doing? It's a good one. Am I the right person to do it? I think it's important. And is this the right thing to do? And giving yourself time, a bit of reflection, to check that you are still in alignment with the vision. Because if you don't, if Henry doesn't manage to realign his heart and his mind within the crisis, he will not be able to move forward to inspire the troops to keep fighting against the odds. He manages to inspire the troops, a wonderful speech drawing on them, calling them "we few, we band of brothers," to unite them together to fight with him. And they do go out and fight, and they win a miraculous victory. But as we move into Act 5, we see him changing tactics completely. In order to achieve the vision, he now actually has to stop the conflict. He's brought together at a peace treaty meeting by the Duke of Burgundy, who's acting a little like Kofi Annan at the time. And his final task is to turn the battlefield into a garden, to take off the armor and figure out what is going to be the relationship building that is going to secure the future, and what is going to happen within the culture that is going to make that future sustainable, and not just another kind of quick victory that might be regressed from later on. So this is what I call Henry's journey. I believe it is the kind of archetypal journey into leadership. And also one could say the archetypal journey in terms of human dilemmas that one will face in the enactment of or the performing of any big project and mission. So you might just, before we go on, like to have a think about which act are you most interested in this morning? Where do you think your next challenge is coming? Which act is it in? Because what we do invite people to do through this little technique we call mythodrama is to use their personal story to reflect off the myth, to see what threads are grabbing your attention, what bits are calling you to pay attention to them. So that's going to be our little outline. That's the skeleton, the backbone of this myth of inspirational leadership. And as we go through the rest of the time now, I'm going to go back through each act in a bit more detail and try and put a little flesh on the bones. You heard Derek Jacobi first thing talking about the muse of fire, the call to imagination. And I think it is something that is really a key piece of inspiration. The imagination is what will inspire people. The vision of the future, that desired picture, has to be imagined before it can be brought into reality. And there are many, many things, I think, in the modern business world that act to kill or suppress imagination. And the notion, I think, why David White and myself and many others are using some of a richer landscape of language than is normally used in business speak is precisely to try and reactivate those imaginative parts of ourselves. One of my associates in England is a poet called William Ayotte, and we've been commissioning him over the last 3 years to write pieces about what our experience of working with leaders. And this is a little piece he calls A Doodle at the Edge. Another meeting, another agenda, another list of buzzwords, initials, and initiatives. PSU is entering phase 3, while the CDR wants G2 to go to level 5. If we go the full 9 yards on this one, if we get proactive, get out of the box, get our teams together and on the same hymn sheet, if we hit the ground running, if we downsize HR, if we get the money on board and our arses into gear, then we can change something, make a difference, change what the other guys changed last week. Meanwhile, the god has left the garden. The muse lies minimized in the corner of our screens. Not dead, not buried, but forgotten and unseen, like a doodle at the edge of an action plan. Me, I say, make a sacrifice to the doodle. Pick some flowers, speak a poem, feed the tiny muse. Draw, paint, sing, or dance, and you'll bring the gods back into the boardroom. The laughing, smiling, weeping gods of the nighttime and the wild. And that sense of what we lose by reducing our full range of imagination to business speak. And I think one of the tasks of humanizing the workplace is to encourage people to find the courage to really speak in a way that is not purely reductionist. So that access to the imagination. And when we kill the imagination, we also find that we lose something else. The spirit, the soul goes. Something intangible is taken out. We may become a lean, mean fighting machine, but find out that no one wants to work for us anymore. And this is a little piece I was given by a chief exec of a local council in England I was working with last year about the danger of efficiency over effectiveness. They were going through a big change program, efficiency drive, and in the middle of this, the chief exec got offered a couple of tickets to a local charity concert. He couldn't go, passed the tickets on, and the management services officer in charge of the efficiency drive went in his place. Being a good local government officer, he wrote a report of his experience of the concert and sent it back to the CEO. The concert was Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, and these were his views. Point 1. For considerable periods, the 4 oboe players had nothing to do. Now, their numbers should be reduced and their work spread over the whole orchestra, thus eliminating peaks of inactivity. Point 2. All of the 12 violins were playing identical notes. This seems an unnecessary duplication. The staff in this section should be cut drastically. If a larger sound is really required, this could be achieved through electronic amplification. Point 3. Much effort was absorbed in the playing of demi-semi-quavers. This seems an excessive refinement. It is recommended that all the notes should be rounded up to the nearest semiquaver. If this was done, it would be possible to use trainees and lower-graded operators. And point 4. No useful purpose is served by repeating with the horns the same passage that has already been played by the strings. If all such redundant passages were eliminated, the concert could be reduced from 2 hours to 20 minutes. If Schubert had attended to these matters, he would probably have had time to finish the bloody thing. So keeping that little bit of room open for the spirit, for the muse, for the imagination. Because the pressures of reporting, of accounting, of meeting the figures and the targets will try and squeeze that spirit out. But I believe it is one of the leader's jobs to be the holder of that spirit, to be the keeper of the flame of the muse, to keep the muse going. How are we going to get access to that muse in and of ourselves? There are many, many ways, but I think if we look at the play of Henry V, we can see that there are a few little points that we can learn from. First of all, I think it's very clear that Henry feels himself to be in a line of service. To me, one of the differences between inspirational leadership and charismatic leadership is that the inspired leader is in the service of something beyond themselves. Whereas charismatic leaders, very often you scrape away the surface and it's fairly self-referential, what I call a kind of egotistical approach to leadership. It can be effective, it can be successful, but I think now with a lot of recent scandals, people are beginning to be suspicious of the kind of heroic leader standing up there, urging people to kind of jump over the cliff with him or her. So that ability to know and to align us and our people around a greater line of service. Something that Albert Schweitzer said, famous philosopher, and towards the end of his life, he was being interviewed by a group of journalists who asked him one of those easy questions. What do you think the destiny of mankind will be? Luckily, he was wise enough not to answer. He said, I do not know what your destiny will be. The only thing I know is this. Only those among you who have sought and found how to serve will be truly happy. Only those among you who have sought and found how to serve will be truly happy. So that sense that finding the right place to serve is what begins to bring us in alignment with that notion of inspiration. Finding the right place to serve. And that's something that I think Henry has done very consciously in the play. We're told in the first scene that he's had a kind of epiphany, a wake-up call at the very moment that his father died. The Archbishop of Canterbury in the first scene says, yea, at that very moment, consideration, like an angel came and whipped the offending Adam out of him, leaving his body as a paradise to envelop and contain celestial spirits. That note, the angel of consideration. And the word consideration comes from the Latin considere, which means to think with and on behalf of others. And to me, it's a kind of prerequisite for effective leadership. Thinking with, the ability to build consensus, and on behalf, acting on behalf of many varied stakeholders, and holding that balance, that dilemma simultaneously. So the angel of consideration is the wake-up call. Henry's had what in England is technically called a dodgy past. He spent a lot of his time hanging out in the wrong kind of pubs with the wrong kind of people. Couldn't possibly happen to a Prince Harry nowadays, but apparently 400 years ago it could. As a result of which, people have been very worried about his leadership potential. But he has proved them wrong. He has emerged from this cloud as a responsible leader. And the reason I believe he's been able to do that is because he has spent some time thinking about what is his sense of purpose. Why does he think he's there? Why has he been put in the position? All right, he's inherited the job. It was a family company. But We each have that ability to define what we do in a particular role. And his sense of purpose is that sense of what gets him up in the morning, apart from the pay packet and the crown, and the kids if he's got them and they get up before him. What gets him up in the morning wanting to serve this company, this place, at this time? Another great playwright, George Bernard Shaw, in a play called Man and Superman, wrote about this sense. He said, this is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being a force of nature instead of some feverish, selfish little clod full of ailments and grievances, constantly complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you feel better. There are two really important things in there for me. First is that when you find your sense of purpose, it's self-validating. A purpose recognized by yourself. Because there are many leaders I work with who are in the place they're in because other people have recognized that that's the place they should be in. That they haven't actually done their own homework to figure out if that's the right place for them to serve. And that's particularly when they can come unstuck in Act 3 and Act 4, when things start to go wrong. And second is that if we do get that self-validating sense of purpose, that is the key to enabling us to withstand great struggle. To go through whatever it takes because we believe we're the right person in the right place at the right time, meeting the right struggle. My personal hero in this regard is Nelson Mandela, who sat in a jail cell for 27 years knowing that he was the right person in the right place if he was going to meet his struggle successfully. So that sense of purpose, what gets us out of bed? And I believe it can change over the course of a life or evolve. I personally started with a sense of purpose that was totally around performance in theatre. I was a theatre director. I did notice eventually that my dad was an actor, my mum was an actor, my two sisters were actors. I went into theatre thinking I had a choice, but there was a lot more chance of me ending up at the Globe Theatre than there was in financial services, frankly. And after I set off with that sense of purpose, and it pointed towards a vision. There was a bigger picture in the future that I actually thought about and wanted to develop towards. And that vision for me was becoming artistic director of the National Theatre, actually of Great Britain, which my dad had done. So I thought that could be a family job if I played my cards right. And I thought I'd get there by the time I was about 35. And by the time I was about 34, I did realize, A, that I was never going to get it, but B, and finally this was more important, I didn't really want it. So there were lots of people around me who were validating that external ambition, but inside it no longer felt the right place for me to be. And I had to reassess the sense of purpose. So theatre was a broad thing, but what specifically gets me out of bed in the morning? And it wasn't actually producing a performance that audiences would come to see. It was working with wisdom stories, stories from our past that encode bits of human knowledge about the human condition. And when I got a good story that had some wisdom in it, I loved that. And it was about developing people. When I was in an arena where I could facilitate meaningful change and peak performance for those around me, that's when I got out of bed in the morning with the muse of fire really sharp and burning bright. So it was the story and the development that I was in it for, not the theatre. So eventually, when I realized that this just trying to do theatre all the time was not enough for me, so what's a vision that could serve? What is it beyond myself that I'm really interested in? And one of the things, and I think David White shares this belief, is the notion that people in the arts tend to have more access to this sense of purpose, that they're willing to go through struggle. We always talk about starving artists and so on. So there is that sense that in the arts people get that sense of purpose. But in business often we get the sense that people don't, or lose it, or they're in it for the money, or they do it for the 4 weeks, a year holiday, or retirement, or whatever it is. And I think we're both very invested in actually trying to bring those two worlds together, finding the place where you can really meet the edge of your identity and rub up against your working life to add meaning to yourself and others around you. So that sense of purpose can feed then a vision of a better world in the future. And then when we've got that vision or have a sense of what that better world will be, then of course we have to think, well, what are we actually going to do to put it into place? What are we going to manifest in the world? In other words, what is our mission going to be? And that becomes then another level of endeavor, thinking about if the mission then is what we're doing, then the vision is why we're doing it. For me, the France, the mission, the big project, the endeavor that we are generally engaged in becomes the mission. But above the mission, what connects us to the group mission is very individual. Sometimes we can share it with people. We have a vision in our company now, as well as a mission. Our picture of the world is one where the world is a well of meaning, fellowship, and abundance, where work can actually supply those needs for people. But our mission in OMA is to develop authentic leaders, because we think without authentic leaders, that world has no chance of coming into being. So that's the sense of alignment, and I think it is something that we'll revisit in Act 4. But first of all, when you get to Act 1, of course, then you have to start taking the steps to put it into practice. So if we are in line, if we believe we're in the right place, if collectively we've signed up to a new mission, then what are the first steps I need to take to deliver that mission in reality? Do I have currently the right skills, the right performance attributes to deliver that? Or do I actually need to enhance my ability to develop my own resources before we go into action? So Act 1 is where Henry finds, builds consent around, and sells the mission. When he gets to the very end of Act 1, he is with all his nobles, and they've agreed to go to France. The French ambassador comes in, because Henry sent him a little letter, as you do, saying, please, may we have your country. And the ambassador comes back with a treasure chest, which everyone assumes is going to be full of gold. Buy him off for a bit. And he opens it, and it's full of tennis balls. And it's a not very subtle insult from the Dauphin, the Prince of France, to tell Henry to kind of leave leadership to the people who know what they're doing and go back to the pubs and the tennis courts. So he receives this insult in the midst of his nobles, and he has to then, he dismisses the ambassador, he has to gather them together with a deep sense of engaged commitment. As the ambassador goes out, his uncle, the Duke of Exeter, says, points at the box and says, "This was a merry message." And Henry says, "We hope to make the sender blush at it. Therefore, my lords, omit no happy hour that may give furtherance to our expedition. For we have now no thought in us but France, save those to God that run before our business. Therefore, let our proportions for these wars be soon collected, and all things thought upon that may, with reasonable swiftness, add more feathers to our wings. For God before we'll chide this Dauphin at his father's door. Therefore, let every man now task his thought, that this fair action may on foot be brought." And you get the sense kind of in the words and in the language that this is going to happen. You know, he's really not saying, we'll go back to the committee and think about it. So finding the right time, I think timing's really important for this, when we actually stand up and deliver that mission in a compelling way that people will buy in and will follow. And that really takes us then to the end of Act 1. As we move into Act 2, we find, first of all, that we are up against some of the disagreeers. Some of the people who are saying or thinking no when we're saying and thinking yes. There are four main types of disagreeers we've distinguished over the years. I call them naysayers, overt critics, covert critics, and traitors. The naysayers are those who aren't afraid to speak their minds, so they'll say no if they think no. They can be very valuable. They can keep our feet on the ground if we are getting a bit carried away. But if they keep saying no all the way through a project, eventually they become blockers and they start getting in our way. Second category are the critics, which, coming from a theatre background, you might imagine these are slightly more negative than the naysayers, because these are the people who seem to prefer criticizing other people's ideas than coming up with their own. Again, they have a value. Their objective analytical skills can be really useful. But if that criticism keeps coming in as we're trying to now, in Act 2, leverage support and resources to move forward into France, again, we can fall down. Writer Henry David Thoreau has a little phrase you may be familiar with. It is better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. Well, the critics in my book prefer cursing the darkness, and if there isn't any darkness around to curse, they'll have a good go criticizing your candle. Which is why you need to look out for them and manage them in this Act 2 phase. In between the vision and the action, this Act 2 phase requires a bit of what I call political intelligence. Third, we have the covert critics. These are the ones who are paying lip service to the vision. So in your meeting, they'll go, oh yes, France, fine, yeah, fully signed up for that. And then they all go down the pub and go, France now, why the hell are we going there? And they cause a lot of damage in organizations and a lot of damage to morale around the people you need to try and move your people forward. And last but not least, the traitors, those who usually say very little, but who are actively working against the mission, who are trying to sabotage the leader or the project that is being proposed. So how can we distinguish these types? You'll see we've tried to create a little tool we can begin to think about this with. It is complex, and this one is looking at the different levels of openness and desire for change of these various stakeholders. The naysayers tend to have high on both. Naysayers are ambitious. They've got their own ideas. Naysayers are likely to want to go to Spain, but they've got a different idea than you, so they're not sharing your vision of being in France. They have a high level of openness because they will tell you in no uncertain terms what they think. And that manifests itself as a certain energy, a high energy response to what's going on, particularly when you're talking about France and particularly when they're talking about Spain. Now that manifests in a different way from the critic. The critic who has at this point a low desire for change. These are the ones who think we'd be lucky if we made it to the Channel Islands, and actually we'd be a lot better off just consolidating around the south coast. So they have a more defensive view. They don't want big visions of the future. They want to maintain what they've already got. And that manifests in energetically. By the way, all these are much easier to spot in one-to-one. All these four people might write you the same email. So you will only really spot the difference in one-to-one or in small group work. The overt critic will be more defensive. So where the naysayer's energy tends to go forward, out and up. No, we don't want to go to France this year. We should go to Spain. Have anyone tasted any Spanish olives recently? You know, the wine's better. They get excited about their mission, and the energy is moving kind of energetically towards Spain. Whereas the critics are treating your idea like a kind of an annoying insect that has to be batted out the way. Do we need another project this year? I think I'd speak for everyone in my department when I say we've got quite enough on our books already. And the energy is going back in and down. So that's an energetic difference that we can begin to spot in people. The covert critic, more difficult to spot because they're not talking to you, almost by definition. So we need help with the covert critics. And I think a lot of people miss this opportunity, but it is that we actually need to go to the supporters, the champions, and ask them to keep their ears and eyes to the ground. What's the gossip in the pubs and the canteens? What are people saying about this on the ground? And having an active feedback system coming back. And sometimes you're spotting clues rather than proof. You know, if one of your supporters walks into a bar where a group of potential covert critics are sitting after a meeting. They've all been stonily silent through the meeting. They're now having a good chin wag, having a good chat in the pub, and your mate walks up to them and shtoom. They all stop talking. That's a clue. It's not proof, but it is a clue. What is it they're talking about? They won't talk about in the meeting, they'll talk about amongst themselves, and won't talk about when someone associated with your position moves into the frame. So we're looking for clues, behavioral clues. And so what the covert critics are doing is hiding something, and that will often manifest itself through limited communication, through lowered eye contact, and you get the sense they don't really want to be in the same room as you if you're the change leader, and they're in that, because they don't really want you to see that they're not on your side. But the traitor, if there is such one, they do tend to be in all large organizations. In fact, I did work with a church charity once, and that had the largest number of traitors per capita of any organization I've ever worked with. They all thought they were being guided by God to stab the other bastards in the back. So these do exist. However ethical our concerns may be in organizations, we do get these saboteurs around. And they tend to be lying. Because they are ambitious, they do want to move forward, they do want to move up a ladder. They have their sight usually on the throne. A lot of traitors want to get to the top, so they are ambitious. But they are not being open and honest with you. So what you're trying to spot in the potential traitor is what I call the lack of alignment. One of the reasons I think it's so important we align ourselves in Act 1 is so we can stand up and say, we're going to France, I think it's the right thing to do. So one of the things that you will notice in traitors is that they can't do that they are faking it. And when that lack of alignment is in the body, when they're pretending to believe in something they don't actually believe in, several things can happen. One, again, is that they will tend never to want to spend any time with you. So they will be kind of leaving the meetings as soon as they can. Second is that it will be very difficult for them to speak in support of the mission or the vision. So they can't stand up and say, we're going to France, because inside they're thinking, no, we're not. And lastly, you can sometimes just trust your intuition about this, because the question that we often ask ourselves about these types is do I believe what they're saying? And that's not quite enough, because if they're saying, oh, France is a good idea, we'll believe it, because that's what we believe. So the question we need to ask ourselves with these types is, do I believe they believe what they're saying? So it's a bit of empathy. We actually have to kind of move into their skin. If I was congruent and aligned, would I be speaking and acting in this particular way? And sometimes you will have a few little clues. Some people, I kid you not, will shake their head when they're trying to say yes. Oh, I can't tell you how signed up I am about France. It's a clue. You have to be careful you're not dealing with anyone who comes from an Albanian background, because they're the only culture in the world that shake their head when they mean yes. But everyone else, it's a universal sign of not agreeing. You also might notice what they do with material. Quite interesting, but the human reaction when we're in the presence of material that relates to a project that we fundamentally disagree with is to get rid of it. So you might just be aware, that if you're given the rollout plan for your bright new project to people, and they go, oh, thanks very much, yeah, I'll have a careful look at that later on, can't wait to see how that's going to be manifesting in practice. What their body's doing is not what their voice is trying to tell you. And it is much harder for us as human beings to get our bodies to lie. It's much easier to convince our voices what to say. Some people even go so far, and I've seen this happen in meetings, to bury it. So you say, here's the rollout plan. They go, oh, thanks very much. Yes, I'll have a careful look at that when I get back to the office. And it's gone. It's been hidden. So by the way, all of this is trying to provoke awareness, not paranoia, I should say. So it's not about thinking that everyone's in this position, but just being aware that if we really believe in our mission, part of our job in Act 2 is to really identify who's for us and who's against us. So the identification, of course, is the first piece. Equally important, if not more so, is actually figuring out how we are going to manage the disagreeers. Now, I believe all of these can be managed in different ways. The naysayers, first of all, are the ones who could be most valuable. It is possible to turn a naysayer, I believe, if you go about it in the right way. Very important up front is that we listen to them. A lot of people don't listen in leadership roles. If we've done our research, we think France is the right place to go. We go to the meeting, say, right, so that's the project. Any disagreement? Right, we're off then. And that's not the kind of listening that is needed. If we don't listen to naysayers, we will turn them into more dangerous critics and sometimes even saboteurs. But if we do listen to them, then at a certain point we need to feed back the listening. Then we can draw a line under the disagreement, and if we can, give them a choice as to how much they're going to be involved in the project. So, paraphrase, meeting with a naysayer, and I think dealing with all these is best done one-to-one and not in a group, if you can, because the group dynamics can change. People can either get scapegoated or rally support around them. But to be able to say, listen, I've heard what you've said about France. I understand you'd rather go to Spain because of the olives and the wine. Is that right? So they know you've listened to them. Then you say, however, in my position, I need you to know the time for disagreement is over. It's very simple, and I can't tell you how many people forget. We've invited lots of consensus and disagreement, and then we forget to stop it. Draw the line. And then in the end, to give them a choice. You say, I'd really like you to be in one of the first ships going over to France because I value, your discrimination, your critical thinking, and your honesty. So you name what is really true about them that you admire, why you want them on your side. But if you can't get behind the mission, then I want you to let me know and I'll find something for you to do back in England. Now, this leverages a little bit of the naysayers' ambition. You remember from the first slide that they had a big desire for change. They want to be storming off to Spain. So what you're subtly doing is saying, well, you help me get to France this year, we're going to have a lot more chance of getting to Spain next year. And most naysayers would rather be on the front of the first boat going into France than stuck in the storeroom at Southampton. Because they might have got a lot more chance of getting a medal, being seen, getting people to recognize their potential for leading future missions. So you often can turn them. But what you don't want to do to naysayer is just say, you've got to come on board, because then they feel they're being pulled against their will, and you don't leverage all their good skills on your side. So there's some things that can be successful with the naysayers. Moving on to the overt critics. I believe we can be a bit tougher with the critics. That in essence, what we want to do is try and shut them up. They've had their say in Act 1 when we were talking about what we were going to do, and now we're actually trying to close them down. To be able to draw a line again, to say, I've heard the criticism you've had, I understand, you don't think we've got the resources for France this year, but we're going. I need to ask you to stop the criticism in our meetings, and what I'm inviting you to do is to help us get there, because actually you are paid to contribute, believe it or not. So just be able to use it. Sometimes if people don't have the authority to manage these people, we invite them to kind of go up a route and come back down, so that the boss or the boss's boss can sometimes have that effect. The covert critics, the next category we talked about, I think can be dealt with possibly the hardest of all, overtly. Although we need to just be careful that we're not dealing with someone who either personally or culturally suffers from low self-esteem. And if we are, send them on an assertiveness course, because anyone who's senior management in modern organisation should be able to say no when that's what they think. If it's not low self-esteem and they are in that kind of covert critical mode, then I think it's time to Zeus them. That's when, we do the thing where you stand in front of a window with the sun blazing behind you, and you get them sitting in a very low seat on the other side of the room. And the impression that you need to convey is that there's very probably a thunderbolt somewhere in your hand, and it's very probably coming their way. And to be able to say the equivalent of, it has come to my attention, that you've been running down this project and this mission behind our backs, behind my back, behind the back of this team. That is not appropriate behavior, and it must stop now. Really close them down as much as you can. And of course, as any good newspaper editor will tell you, never reveal your source, because then you will definitely limit the damage. They won't stop complaining. They will go back down the pub with their closest mates and go, now I'm not even allowed to complain, right? But you will tend to reduce it only to the few because they don't know who squealed on them. So they will be much more careful in future because they don't much enjoy the thunderbolts. So that, I think, is where we can use what I call the power distance that we can often get as leaders in authority. And last but not least, the traitors. I believe if you come to a point where you have sufficient evidence that someone is trying to undermine you or the project that you've aligned yourself with in Act 1, you need to create distance between you. If you can create distance between their head and their neck, as Henry did, probably even better. But create distance between you and them is a priority, as soon as is practically possible. A number of people I've worked with, coached through some of these treacherous attacks who have tried to keep on making it work for 2 years. And in the end say, if I'd known, then what I know now, I would have done anything rather than keep myself in a close working relationship. So I think that means in practice we're trying to move them on or out. I've worked with some people who actually have chosen themselves to move on or out because the traitor was politically protected and networked to all the right people, and they said that was one of the best moves they ever did in their career. And of course, be careful. Be careful. The traitor is more likely to be operating in a sly way. Now, one of the things I think is difficult for some people to come to terms with around this, which is one of those potentially ugly bits, I think, of leadership, is that you cannot defeat a traitor by being open, fair, and 100% transparent. Because you're not playing on an even playing field. So you have to be sly for the right reason. So we have to maintain our integrity, but act in a way that isn't always revealing every move. I honestly believe the best end to a relationship with a traitor is if you can walk into their office one morning and say, "Oh, congratulations, I hear you've got that wonderful job in Siberia, was it? I just want to thank you for all the effort you've put into this team and wish you all the best for the future." Don't give them any way to come back. You go into the office and go, "Ha, Siberia, who do you think arranged that then?" They will come back from around the other side of the world to stab you. So be careful, be careful. And of course, many of us have to deal with them in different ways, particularly in public service. It's a lot more difficult to act in a way to create distance, and we sometimes have to have strategies to help move them away. And even sometimes find them the kind of role they really want that doesn't involve us or our team. So that will be some of the little ways we've come up with in the past to think about the traitors. So what I'd like to do next, if I may, we'll have a little kind of chat in a few moments about something, but I'd like to just introduce you next to this little model of positive leadership potentials. You'll see here it represents 4 characters up here, using the theatre metaphor again. We've got the good king, we've got the warrior, we've got the medicine woman, and we've got the great mother. They represent different fundamental areas of interest: order, action, change, and nurture. And they are also bolstered by what we call the kind of archetypal energies in the world. The post-Jungians identified as being masculine, feminine, static, and dynamic. And this has nothing to do with gender, physical, external gender. This is an internal psychological reality, a bit like yin and yang in some of the Eastern cultures and philosophy. And when these different energies combine, they create these pockets of interest that these characters most naturally inhabit. So most things in this world start in the place of change. The medicine women. When the dynamic feminine energies in the world come together, that's where we create the seeds of the new, the visions, the dreams, the intuitions of the future. That's when we see a stuck or a sick situation and find some way to bring healing or new life to it. And some of us are most inspired when we get to operate in areas where that is called on most often, to create those seeds, to innovate. Those seeds of change, however, require nurturing. And in order to really embed understanding in our people and nurture the idea sufficiently that it be put into action, we need this kind of incubation phase. So that's where we need to move into the place where the static feminine energies combine to create the character we call the Great Mother. Because there we manage the emotional reality of change for people. It was that James Baldwin, American writer, said, most of us are about as eager to be changed as we were to be born, and go through our changes in a similar state of shock. Now, the medicine women love change. They'll reinvent the wheel every week if they get the chance. But the rest of the characters tend to have a different reaction. That reaction needs to be managed. If we have managed that reaction, built understanding, whether it's a product, a process, or a person we're developing relationship with in this area, then we're ready to go into action to achieve performance. Then we're ready to move into the place where the dynamic masculine energy comes to get it done, to go into action on the ground in pursuit of a clearly directed goal or target. And eventually, of course, if we've tried it on the ground, we've put it into action, we need to assess it, we need to analyze, we need to strategize. We move to the last place, the place of the good king, where the static masculine energies combine to create the ordering principle, where rules, regulations, boundaries are determined and strategies are planned for the future rollout. So that's the little notion of how these characters operate in the world. And we're going to invite you to think about what might be your favorite character. We find that almost all leaders and managers, all human beings I've worked with, but certainly applying it in leadership, have one or two favorite characters. And usually most people also have a least favorite character. Now, in terms of what I'm talking about, authentic performance, we need to know which our favorite is, but we actually need to be able to access all four to be able to successfully complete any one big mission or project. They all naturally kind of have different attributes that come with them. These are not, it's not science in this is a ballpark, so not every word will fit you, but you might just think from any analysis you've done of yourselves or 360 feedback you've had, how do you think you come across to other people? Which of these four characters do you most fit into? And also, equally important, which of the four characters do you think you least fit into? Because that also has an impact on how we lead others and which challenges of leadership we find inspiring and not. So we talk about this using the theatre metaphor, and in the workshops we do, we train people to perform these characters, these different archetypal energies, to embody them in a way that they can believe in it. And that's the notion of kind of acting in the future. To embody it, rehearse it like an actor would before they go on stage, and then be able to move forward with it, more with a sense of it being in the body. For now, we can just have a little look at what happens, first of all, when we don't move between all four equally, that we can get stuck in one. We get what in acting we call typecast. You see someone appear on screen and they're the hero or the baddie or the funny friend because that's what they do. Well, people in senior management positions can actually suffer from the same kind of typecasting. And if we stay in the right place for too long, we eventually turn into the negative potential that lies behind the shadow of the positive potential. So the medicine women turn into the mad women, addicted to change, trying to reinvent the wheel every 3 days because that's what gets them out of bed in the morning. And eventually everyone else says, this is chaos, this is insane, can we just have a simple plan? The great mothers who are nurturing, developing relationships, building trust and empathy with people can over-nurture, can start to smother the very energy that in their fullness they release. And they can also have a tough job sometimes calling people to account on discipline, standards and behaviors because they're invested in the relationship. The warriors can very often turn into the mercenary tyrants where they get, can't put the sword down, forgot what a scabbard looks like, go out fighting the good fight all day, but come back to home office in the evening, oh, sorry, 3 friends' heads rolling on the floor. Friendly fire happens to the best of us. Next project. And last but not least, the good kings can turn into the senex, the bitter old man, where we get caught in what's often called analysis paralysis. Too much order, over-control, over-analyzing everything, not working till we've got all the information, decisions being postponed and postponed because we never get all the information, and also sometimes operating in a way like protecting their own boundaries. So it becomes a protectionist system rather than expansionist in terms of releasing potential throughout the organization, and they want to hold on to their own power no matter what. So each has a positive, each has a negative potential. And you might start thinking about which is your tendency, which one is your favorite, and when, if ever, does then the shadow kind of emerge through the positive. But just before we do that, we'll also have a look at the other. If this is what happens when we overplay our favorite character, what happens if we don't access all 4? What happens if we miss one out? Well, using the little color coding there, and looking back at the first slide, you'll see that the way I'm interpreting the story, Henry needs to access all 4 characters to get from the beginning to end of his mission. He needs the medicine woman to call to imagination and to vision the future. He needs the good king to assess the past and allocate resources. He needs the warrior to deal with the traitors, take the first steps, and inspire the troops to fight against the odds. And last but not least, he definitely needs the Great Mother to survive the dark night, the time of doubt and uncertainty, and to build a sustainable future to turn the battlefield into a garden in Act 5 and build relationships. So if you notice, if you've got a sense of where your least favorite character is, just notice where it appears on that slide. The chances are that we don't pay those challenges as much attention as we do the challenges that most naturally respond to our favorite characters. So a couple of examples would be that great mothers often have a really hard time dealing with traitors. Why? Because they don't see traitors. They only see potential friends. And the warriors hardly ever bother with Act 5 because they get to the end of Act 4 and go, right, that's France, where's Spain? And everyone else still kind of running along behind. So there is a downside to not having the kind of balanced scorecard. I never believe we'll be perfectly balanced, but the aim is to be able to access each character effectively enough to survive the behavioral challenge that will be required of you. So I thought we'd do is just give you 5 minutes round your tables now to have a little think about this and to look at what might be what I'm calling your inner traitor. The habit, behavior, and attitude that comes either with overplaying your favorite character or underplaying the least favorite character that will get in your way. See, we've also got team, department, and organization down, but in 5 minutes, again, just to start a conversation with the person sitting next to you. If they know you well, all to the good, because hopefully they won't let you bullshit them. Be honest with them. No, you're a bleeding tyrant is an appropriate response, if that's what you think. So we'll start the conversation for 5 minutes and then carry on, and you can continue it later if you wish. Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt, but you've got a decent lunch break coming up in half an hour. So please do continue, like we were saying before. We'll try and kind of provoke a few interesting conversations that you take out and continue rather than being able to complete them within this time frame. But I'd like now to move into Act 3. In Act 3, Henry has set off with a very simple strategic plan, which is to land on the coast of France at a little town called Harfleur, a small walled town. He plans to arrive in mid-August, which is good fighting weather. He plans to arrive with 10,000 troops, which was a good mobile force for those days, and he plans to take that town in 1 week, march on through France, and be in Paris by Christmas. But however, like most simple strategic plans, they don't go quite so smoothly on the ground as when you plan them at the castle. Henry's is no exception. When we next meet him in Act 3, Scene 1, he has been on the ground at Harfleur for 3 months. It is now the middle of October. In those 3 months, he has lost 2,000 of his 10,000 troops without winning a single bit of territory. Another 3,000 have called in sick with dysentery from living in a marsh for 3 months, and the remaining 5,000, as you might imagine, are not particularly impressed with the current situation. So his challenge changes from building the vision in Act 1, managing the disagreeers and the internal resources in Act 2. In Act 3, he has to motivate the demotivated troops. So if I could ask you to role play for me, briefly, a group of exhausted 15th century soldiers, easier for some than others. I'm just going to speak Henry's words to you, and you just think what might resonate with you. That motivation, the root of the word motivate, movere, is to move. Now, he's not changing their target. All he's trying to do is change their energy and their behavior about achieving the same target. Okay, that's his task. So he comes in on day 91 of the campaign while all his soldiers are getting all their weapons together for the next push. And he tells them comes in to say that your task today is to go once more unto the breach, dear friends. Once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. In peace, there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger. Stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard favoured rage. Now lend the eye a terrible aspect. Let it pry through the portage of the head like a brass cannon. Now set the teeth, stretch the nostril wide, hold hard the breath, and bend up every spirit to his full height. On, you noble English. Dishonour not your mothers. Now attest that those you call fathers did beget you. And you, good yeomen, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the mettle of your pasture, which I doubt not, for there is none of you so mean and base that hath not noble lustre in your eyes. I see you stand, like greyhounds in the slips, straining upon the start. The game's afoot. Upon this charge follow your spirit, and cry God for Harry, England, and St. George. So that's what he said. Thank you. Thank you. That's what he says. But what's he doing? What's he really doing? He's shifting something in their internal structure. He's changing the pictures in their head and the energy in their body. And he starts by calling them a dear friend. When was the last time you were 3 months late delivering a project and your boss called you a dear friend? Okay. But when people are stuck through no fault of their own, they need you to include yourself as part of the problem. And he frames the problem as an opportunity. Then he goes on to give them an image of how to be. The tiger, the greyhound. He reminds them of what unites them together. What's the common cause? What's the mission? What's the vision that we're in this for? He brings them back to the big picture. He even says, don't let your mum down. What are the common things that hold us together? And he brings them back. There was a little story I was reminded about when Lou was talking this morning about the cathedral of Christopher Wren, when he was building St. Paul's Cathedral opposite the Thames from the Globe. And apparently, he was going out one morning to check that a particular team knew what they were doing. And they were all building the same wall, but they all had a different definition of their job. And the first person, he said, what you doing? And the first person said, I put sticky stuff on bricks. That's my job. Fine. And the next person said, oh, I'm helping build a wall. Fine. Next person, I'm part of a team building a cathedral. Good. Last one, I'm part of a whole community building a cathedral for the glory of God. Okay? Now, the argument that's usually given is that the fourth person is the one you most want working for you, because they've seen where sticky stuff on bricks connects to the big picture, the big cathedral. My argument is most people have been putting sticky stuff on bricks for 8 or 9 months, haven't a clue what cathedral they're trying to build. And at certain times, the leader's role is to remind them, reconnect the brick to the cathedral, to live the bridge between the step they're making now and the big vision that we're all collectively serving. To make that real for people. And I think that's a key thing that Henry is doing in there, to motivate, to move these people, moving them forward by that picture of the aspirational future, and by calling on some of the universal motivational keys to get people going. Now, for me, in terms of the little model we were just working with, that calls on a mixture of the warrior and the medicine woman. The medicine woman actually has to come up with the new perspective, and then the warrior has to deliver it with a bit of oomph and confidence and energy. Now, sometimes those of us who might prefer the good king character can sometimes make a mistake at this juncture, because a lot of good kings we've worked with in our workshops who have to try and motivate people would come up with something very different than what Henry came up. A lot of them would come in and say, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to the meeting. Although I'm sure everyone here knows why it was necessary for me to call another briefing on day 91 of the campaign. We did set you a very simple strategic target on week 1 to take that town in 1 week. This means that you are currently running 84 days behind schedule. That's going to have severe budget implications for the rest of the campaign, as the finance director will be along to tell you in a moment. Current figures from the sick bay show there are 3,000 of you claiming sick leave. And this morning's figures from the morgue show us there are currently 2,000 of you dead. Which often doesn't have quite the same effect. And again, the question is not what do I want to say, but what do they need to hear? It's a different frame. And if we've got all the information, all the figures, we'll be tempted to lay it on all of them. But they do not need to know. It's true, everything I just said, apart from the finance director, was historically accurate. None of it was remotely helpful. So knowing what's going to move your people forward at the right time. The next thing he does, he achieves part of his goal. That after the next attack, the governor of Harfleur comes out and asks for a peace parley. Now he uses another influencing technique, which is very key, and this is painting negative pictures. Selling a vision often involves painting positive pictures. Equally important at times can be negative pictures, which can leverage complacency and move people away from being stuck in an entrenched position. And when Henry speaks to the governor of Harfleur, he says this. And just see, again, if you perhaps were the men and women of the Council of Harfleur, you're hearing me make my pitch, and at the end of this speech, you're going to vote, and the vote's going to be whether you continue the siege or whether you allow Henry and his troops to have finally their ownership of Harfleur. So the governor comes out on top of the gates, and Henry says, "This is the latest parley we will admit. As I am a soldier, a name which in my thoughts becomes me best, if I begin the battery once again, I will not leave the half-achieved Harfleur till in her ashes she lie buried. The gates of mercy shall be all shut up. What is it then to me if impious war, arrayed in flames like to the prince of fiends, do with his smirched complexion all fell feats in link to waste and desolation? What is it to me if you yourselves are cause, if your pure maidens fall into the hands of hot and forcing violation? What reign can hold licentious wickedness when down the hill he holds his fierce career? We may as bootless spend our vain command upon the enraged soldiers in their spoil as send an invitation to a sea monster to come ashore. Therefore, you men of Harfleur, take pity of your town and of your people, while yet my soldiers are in my command. If not, why in a moment look to see the blind and bloody soldier with foul hand defile the locks of your shrill shrieking daughters? Your most reverend fathers, taken by their silver beards and their reverend heads dashed against the walls. Your naked infants, spitted upon pikes, whilst their mad mothers, with their howls confused, do break the clouds as they did at Herod's bloody hunting slaughter ground. What say you? Will you yield, and this avoid, or guilty in defense, be thus destroyed? Will you yield, and this avoid, or guilty in defense, be thus destroyed? Get the picture? That's the power of a negative picture. Now, to deliver it, of course, you have to have imagined it first. There has to be a seed of truth in it. Because otherwise you do it once, people don't believe it, you're gone. There has to be a seed of truth that if we don't do this, this and this and this will happen. And in 2 years, this is what I see happening. And so you have to invest yourself imaginatively in the future and then describe it in a way. And again, what's he say? He doesn't talk about him, he talks about them. You know, what's in it for you to do what he is currently asking you to do? Not about what's in it for him. So the negative picture used at the right way at the right time. One thing I would say, is, by the way, the motivating and negative pictures need to be done separately. Yeah? You can't, once more onto the breach or I'll fire the lot of you. It does not work. So choosing the right frame for the right moment is a key. And this gets Henry through his first block, first territory. Now he changes tactics. Now, instead of pushing on for Paris, he tries to move sideways to Calais, where he can rest up for the winter and get more resources for the spring. But the French have other ideas. They chase him with 40,000 fresh French mounted troops and surround him on the field of Agincourt. Montjoy, the herald of the French king, goes into Henry's tent with what amounts to a very simple message, which is a choice, one of two options. Choice one, give up now. You'll pay a huge fine, a ransom for all the damage you've caused, but you and all your people will be free to go home tomorrow. Choice two, fight us tomorrow and we'll kill you all. At which point we usually ask people to consider, what would you do? And how would you go about making the decision? When is 40,000 lined up against you simply another barrier to be overcome? And when is it a sign you've gone the wrong way? And how do you, as an individual, make that choice? There isn't a right choice. There's only the individual choice that you will make in the moment. So this is the dilemma that sends Henry into what I call the dark night. This is the bit where he has to investigate himself and his troops simultaneously. In the dark night, we've started in Act 1 with a vision of the future. We've got to where we are, we look at a brighter future, and we plan it. We say, that's the vision, and then we set off to try and achieve it. At a certain point, however, we find ourselves stuck in the woods. We find ourselves losing sight of the vision. In the middle, something David uses a lot, David White, in the middle of my life, I awoke and find the way was wholly lost. Beginning of Dante's Inferno, the dark night. Inevitable in any meaningful project, in any meaningful career. The point where we lose sight of what started us in the first place. So, few little things that Shakespeare, with his genius, shows Henry doing to manage that dark night. The first is visible leadership. What nowadays we'd call MBWA, management by walking about, being seen in the crisis. The chorus of Act 4 tells us that all the English soldiers are waiting around the camp that night with lank, lean faces and war-worn coats, looking like so many horrid ghosts. But who will behold the royal captain of this band? For forth he goes and visits all his host, bids them good morrow with a modest smile, calls them brother, friend, countryman. Upon his royal face, there is no note how dread an army hath surrounded them. A largesse, universal like the sun, his liberal eye doth give to everyone, thawing cold fear. So that mean and gentle all may, as may unworthiness define, receive a little touch of Harry in the night. A little touch of Harry in the night. That ability to go out and make that personal contact when your people are feeling distraught, abandoned, and afraid. Making what appears to be a hopeless situation feel better because you're making the effort. And particularly those of us in leaders, you know this as CEOs, but people give us power distance. People project their hopes, their fears, their uncertainties on us. When you walk through the door of your office, when everyone's in a bad time, everyone's looking at you. What's on their face today? Can I gather hope for it, or are things still going pretty bad? So going out, now that takes a little mixture for me of the good king and the warrior. The good king knows how to hold authority, knows how to hold the royal face. But intuitively, Shakespeare calls it the royal face. And I think he's asking us to distinguish the royal face from the human face, managing them separately in a crisis. Now, sometimes the great mothers make a mistake here because they believe in transparency and honesty. So they go out in the middle of the dark night, if they do go out, they can get the courage to leave, and say, well, I understand there are a few concerns about the battle, and I thought maybe we could have a little Q&A. Yep, no, thank you, sir. No, they do have 40,000, very accurate number. Yes, sir, no, currently 5,000 fully fit on our side, very true. Hoping a few more will join us from sick bay in the morning. Again, it's true, but it's not helpful. And knowing when, particularly because the great mother character is so invested in being real with people, this is where you need to know when is real too much. What do they need to know? Not what do I want to say. What do they need to know at this point? So that's what he achieves with the visible leadership, is thawing their cold fear. But equally important, his next little step, which I call honoring his private truth. So when he has been around the troops, he now takes time to be with his brother. And this is a bit that I call the mentoring bit, where he says, brother, 'tis true, we're in great danger. That's his private truth. And he needs someone to say that to. You know this. As a result of that time spent with his trusted brother, he acknowledges that he doesn't yet know if he's the right person in the right place trying to do the right thing. And so his next step is to take a time out. Time alone by himself in the midst of the crisis. He's starting to get all this pressure. All the nobles want a strategy meeting, and he says, no. I and my bosom must debate a while, and then I would no other company. I and my bosom must debate a while. Again, brilliant emotional intelligence from Shakespeare 400 years ago. His head and his heart have got to have an internal conversation to realign themselves before he's got any hope of going back to realign the hearts and minds of his troops in a sustained way to face the upcoming battle. It is something that I think people forget, and because of the pressures, management and leadership, we often say, I don't have time to take that reflection. And I'm sure that you guys encourage them to do so. But how do you actually take that time out in the middle of the crisis? He actually ends up listening to the troops, getting the feedback from the ground, again, and they're waiting to die, and like troops the world over, they're very happy to blame all their problems on the CEO. So if this battle does not go well, it will be a bad matter for the king that led us to it. And he's at this point kind of in disguise, taken the crown off, put a blanket on, bit of mud on his face, so no one quite recognizes him. So he hears the troops' truth. And when they go off, he is left now feeling the burden of leadership. And what he has to do, therefore, is find a place to unload it. Now, this is a universal burden. We talk about lonely at the top. This is how it feels like when you've got 8,000 people whose lives are resting on you. And they've all said it's the king's fault. And what's going to happen to my pension plan, if this battle doesn't go well? And he's left alone on stage for the first time in a soliloquy, and he says, upon the king, let us our lives, our wives, our debts, our careful children, and our sins lay on the king. We must bear all. Oh, hard condition, twin-born with greatness, subject to the breath of every fool whose sense no more can feel but his own ringing. What infinite heart's ease must kings neglect that private men enjoy. And that's the truth about leadership. What infinite heart's ease must leaders neglect that private men and women enjoy. And knowing how to manage that burden, and knowing that the only way you're actually going to manage it is if you do believe you're the right person in the right place at the right time. And if you're not, the dark night is a sign that you've gone the right way. If you are the right person, then you have the opportunity to do what I call acknowledging the shadow, which is a little bit perhaps of what you've been talking about at your tables, when the bit of you that gets in your way might come up when you're trying to move things forward. And then having done that, he is able finally to go back in to try and inspire the troops. So having done the burden, he acknowledges the bit of him that might make the wrong decision for the wrong reason, and then he's able to have a go at talking from his core values in a way that will realign him with the vision even in the middle of the forest. So when he goes back, and we'll finish with this, his nobles are now waiting for him to give them a bit of help, a bit of inspiration. And they are naturally worried. They're saying, the French have full 70,000 men, besides they're all fresh. 'Tis a fearful odds. Oh, that we now had here today but 1/10,000 of those men in England that do no work today. Funny that, senior management wanting more resources in a crisis. Inevitable, but only get another 10,000, 6 months, million, we'd have a chance. But when you can't get them and you haven't got them, what is it that we can say that is authentic, that is about who you are, that you are willing at that point to share in a courageous way with the people who you're asking to make sacrifices for you? So Henry comes in. His cousin, the Duke of Westmoreland, asks for 10,000 more troops and says, what's he that wishes, sir? My cousin, Westmoreland. No, my fair cousin. If we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor. By Jove, I'm not covetous for gold. It yearns me not if men my garments wear. Such outward things dwell not in my desires. But if it be a sin to covet honor, I am the most offending soul alive. No, faith, my cousin, wish not one man more from England. Rather proclaim it, Westmoreland, throughout our host, that he that hath no stomach for this fight, let him depart. His passport shall be made, and coins for convoy put into his purse. We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will rouse him on tiptoe when this day is named. Rouse him at the very name of Crispian. He that outlives this day and sees old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbours and say, tomorrow is St. Crispin's day. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. Old men forget, and all shall be forgot, but he'll remember, with advantages, the feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in his mouth as household words, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall never go by from this day to the very ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England, now abed, shall think themselves accursed that they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whiles any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. And a messenger comes in and says, the French are ready to fight. Seek to know if you are ready for battle. And Henry says, all things are ready if our minds be so. Something every sports psychologist in the world would agree with. All things are ready if our minds be so. Westmoreland says, perish the man whose mind is backward now. And Henry says, oh, thou dost not wish more help from England, coz? Westmoreland says, God's will, my liege, would you and I alone, without more help, could fight this royal battle. And he said, why? Now thou hast unwished us 5,000 men, which likes me better than you wish us one. You know your places. God speed you all. And that's how he sends them off to fight. What's in it for him? I think I'm the right person in the right place. This is the honourable thing to do. What's in it for you? The brotherhood, the memory, the picture of the future of what we did to help make the world a better place. So I'll finish with two lines you may be familiar with from Margaret Mead, great anthropologist who studied cultures all over the world and history throughout history. She came to the end of her life and she said this: never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Thank you. you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Delightful. Thank you. It's
Thank
wonderful.
you.
So how did I do? Oh, wonderful. Thank you. That was just takes my breath away.